Now it is recording. Thank you.
All right, great.
Okay, so I'm just gonna ask you a set of questions that we already brought up, and
Sure.
let's answer honestly. Okay, so how have Muslim women leaders made an impact in their communities and in the world?
Okay, so so when we think about leaders, um, you know, there are the major prime ministers, from South Asia. I'm going to mainly focus on South Asia here. So we have Sheikh Hasina Wajid, who is currently the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. And what is fascinating about Bangladesh is that of the two main parties, think about, if you had Democrats and Republicans, and if both parties were led by women, so that whichever party won, you would have a woman leader. That's the situation in Bangladesh. So we have Sheikh Hasina Wajid, who is the current prime minister, but her opposition is led by Begum Khalida Zia. So both leaders are women, but Sheikh Hasina Wajid has been a leader since 2009. Another leader from South Asia that I would say a Muslim leader is, again, we're talking about prime ministers here, Benazir Bhutto, who was, I'm trying to remember when she was assassinated. She was running for elections when she was assassinated in 2007. Wow, I thought it was more recent than that. So 2007, she was killed. This was, Pakistan was coming out of a long period of military dictatorship at that time, and so it was interesting that she was in fact going to win if she hadn't been murdered by one of the, it was probably done by Islamic terrorists who were trying to disrupt the process. So these are two major women leaders. So, and your question was, what did they do for the people, or?
Wait, hold on. I hold up. Made an impact in their communities and the world. So the question was, how have Muslim women leaders made an impact in their communities and in the world?
Yeah. Okay. So the thing is, we hear about immigration. There's all this sense of people coming from the south, coming into the US, and it's a terror. It's something that there's a lot of political rhetoric right now in Bangladesh, because of what is going on in Myanmar. You have a lot of refugees who've gone into Bangladesh, and in fact, Bangladesh has taken a very large number of refugees in ways that we would never do. We have never done that sort of thing. And it has been a real strain because Bangladesh is a very poor country. But, there have been other ways in which I'm very critical of many things about the current prime minister, so I won't go into the details about that. So it's not as if I think she's the best leader in the world,
Okay.
but there have been challenges that she's faced, and also Bangladesh, it's a small, poor country next to India, which is a very rich, much richer country, but Bangladesh does much better on many of the sort of human development, the ways that you judge human development. They do much better than India,
Okay.
when it comes to women's education, when it comes to people's health, general levels of health and things like that. So there's a lot that they have done. I mean, she has very bad dictatorial tendencies,
Okay.
and so I don't want to sit there saying, oh, women leaders are the best in the
Yeah.
world. And she's been brutal to her opposition. So, there's that. But I also want to get away from only talking about the prime ministers and those sorts of leaders. Okay, so I talked about Bangladesh. I talked about Pakistan earlier. There were two really amazing women who are both their sisters. And so
Yes, I remember Dr. Gittinger mentioned that in her interview.
Who
One of them stayed in Bangladesh with one of her children, and her sister went off to somewhere else, I think.
I
Possibly.
don't think you're talking about the same
Maybe
person.
not.
Yeah, I don't think so. So these two women, Hina Jalani and Asma Jahangir, they are the two people.
Okay.
So so here's something I can send you: Muslim Women Challenging Islamic Fundamentalism. These two, they are human rights activists who have had tremendous danger, that under which they are fighting. And so so these are two women who have done, against things like honor killings, representing women who are trying to escape marriages that are abusive, and often their own families, could be the husband's family, but it could also be their own parents, who, or cousins or somebody who might kill them. That's called honor killing. And these are women who are really fighting against those. They're fighting against things like acid attacks against women. So I would encourage you to look up these two women. I can give you a list of people to look up if you're trying to figure out who Muslim leaders are. And something else I would talk about is India actually has the world's second largest Muslim population in the world. Even though it's a Hindu majority country and Muslims are only 18% of the population, they're still, because India, the entire country is so populous that India becomes the second most populous Muslim country, And some years ago, the Hindu fundamentalist government brought up new citizenship laws that would basically disenfranchise Muslims living in India. Okay, so they required that if you're not a Hindu or a Buddhist and all that, then you have to have paper documents to establish that you are in fact an Indian citizen. And Muslims, many of whom are very poor, and they are born in it at home. There's nobody issuing birth certificates, and so many of them suddenly would be stateless, right? And so there were huge protests, and they were led by women, Muslim women, and so there was not any one name, but it was collectively Muslim women fighting for their rights, in this place called Shaheen Bagh. And so I can send you something on that. So I can read you. Shaheen Bagh protests were led by Indian Muslim women on December 15, 2019, only to be interrupted in March 2020 by COVID-19 restrictions. That was when they were made to leave. And this was against the Indian Citizenship Amendment Act that they were fighting against. And so this hasn't entirely gone into effect thanks to the protests. But I can, if it hadn't been for these women, and if you'd seen pictures of them, they were, if I was presenting, I would have shown pictures. These are very traditional women, wearing, headscarves and things like that, who were, who had left their homes to sit and protest, against the might of the Indian government, which has been very brutal. So these are the ways in which these women have contributed to the world around them.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
that was really interesting. I want to look into that more actually. I think we
Okay.
could add that definitely tomorrow.
All right.
Okay, so on to the next question.
Yeah.
So what role do Muslim women leaders play in promoting interfaith dialogue and understanding?
Interfaith dialogue and understanding. So, when you think about, again, we have to take these countries separately, right?
Mhm.
And so, one thing that Benazir Bhutto, it wasn't so much interfaith dialogue, but in Pakistan, the issue is that you have Muslim fundamentalism trying to take hold, and even though Pakistan is a Muslim country, it kind of was formed as a Muslim country. Okay, so, but she was fighting for a more secular version of it. So, in that sense, having to fight the forces of fundamentalism, which would be very, so Muslim fundamentalists in Muslim militants, militant fundamentalism in Pakistan means that Shia shrines are blown up, so it isn't just about being Muslim, it's about Sunni versus Shia, so Shia shrines being blown up, any kind of form of Muslim worship that's not very conservative and fundamentalist would all be suspect. You have murders of people who are Christian in Pakistan. Suddenly you have somebody who would say that you've blasphemed, and the punishment for blasphemy is death. And so, there were ways in which she would have had to fight those, right? She would have to fight that. So, we're not talking about interfaith dialogue is nothing. We are talking about, survival. We are talking about, fighting against the, forces of, and intolerance and so on. And Sheikh Hasina Wajid, I don't know that I would say she's promoted interfaith dialogue. In fact, under her, there have been threats against minorities, and that's why I don't want to make it seem like somehow these people are amazing or anything like that. And who knows if Benazir Bhutto might have had to make deals that would be unpleasant, that would not be very good. And Muslim women in India are fighting for survival. Forget about interfaith dialogue; they are the minority, right? And so, so I think that question itself is not one that's applicable. It's not very applicable in this context, right?
Yeah.
So there have been in recent years sort of attacks against people who are non-Muslim in Bangladesh, that Sheikh Hasina Wajid in Bangladesh has not done much about it. On the other hand, India is a very powerful neighbor next to them, and the terrible things that India is doing to Muslims, she doesn't take a stance against it. She is in fact trying to be friendly with the government that's very harmful to Muslims. So it's a complex thing. I wouldn't say that, because I'm being asked about Muslim women, I'm going to just be, oh yeah, it's all great. But there are some amazing women who are fighting, some really dangerous forces, like the women I was talking about, the sisters, Hina Jalani and Asma Jahangir in Pakistan, or the women fighting against losing their citizenship in India.
Yeah. That question, I appreciate.
Yeah,
I appreciate the truth of it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Next question. So, what lessons can we learn from the leadership styles of Muslim women? leaders in South Asia? Is that true?
You know, I think I don't know that. Because I have a tendency to be critical, you know. So I would say what we can learn, you know, I'm going to get away from speaking about the prime ministers here.
Okay.
But I would talk about other leaders, you know, who are fighting the fight on the ground. Is sometimes you have to take risks, you know, and look at us, you know, we have women in this, people who have children in this country are under threat of losing our rights over our own bodies, right? With the right to choice being taken away, not just in this state but many states. And you don't really, it's not something that we are talking about very much. I mean, we're not holding big protests here and so on. And so what we can learn from people like Hina Jalani and Asma Jahangir, or the women who are on the streets protesting, is that you have to fight for your rights. And, you know, it's unpleasant, it's not, you know, but you have to, you know, take charge of your own life and, you know, mobilize and do something to change the world. I think that's what I would say about these people who are working in the grassroots. To me, they are the real leaders, not the prime ministers.
Yes.
You know, because the prime ministers are politicians, and they. I wish we didn't learn a whole lot on how to run our lives through from them, you know, except maybe what not to do. So yeah, that's what I would say about.
Yeah, I like just leader doesn't just mean anyone like in a position of power and
yes, exactly.
I thank you for that answer. I really like
yes.
That. Okay, so this is going to be the last answer.
Sure.
Last question pre-written, and then I'm going to ask you one more.
Okay, great.
Okay, so this one is: how have Muslim women leaders played a role in promoting education and empowerment for girls and women?
Yeah, so I think there I could give the example of Bangladesh, you know, where I wouldn't say it was just the women leaders, you know, it's taken place over time, but you know, it has been women leaders who have led the country since the military dictatorship was ended. And so you do find that in Bangladesh there was a lot of for instance, the government has played a big role in, for instance, they had something called the Grameen Bank, you know, which is a model for the rest of the world, where microloans were given to women. And not only microloans, they formed peer groups so that the women promised that they would not give a dowry for their daughters, nor take a dowry for their sons, that they would educate their daughters just as they educate their sons. And so through this form of providing funding, the women themselves were able to get out of poverty. But there was also another side to it where they had to sort of commit to certain ways of being, which imparted more equality in the next generation between their sons and daughters. And I think this made a big difference for Bangladesh. You know, they set up a lot of factories which have very exploitative labor. Labor conditions are bad, there's no question about it. But it's the kind of labor where women are able to do jobs as opposed to not doing jobs at all. And so even though the conditions have been very bad, the women have been able to control their lives a lot more through those jobs, right? Because they can break away from their families and so on. And there has been a lot of women working in those labor forces are able to become labor leaders and fight for their rights. right? So those things, those sort of changes that have taken place in Bangladesh over the last 30 years or so have really changed the status of women, so much so that women in Bangladesh collectively do a lot better. You know, we think of Muslims as being not very progressive when it comes to women, and so compared to India, they should be doing much worse, but actually they do much better, right? So, and even things like, you know, providing, you know, because in countries where women have to, when there are no indoor toilets and women have to go into the forest, it's very dangerous. They get raped, you know, and because this is something they can't use in the during daytime, you know, they have to sort of not use the bathroom all day until the sun goes down, right? Or wake up really early in the morning. And these things are dangerous to women physically because of attacks, but it's also bad for their health to not go to the bathroom, right? And so by building toilets, the country has done an amazing job in women's protection. You know, it's a kind of thing people say, oh, I don't want to talk about toilets, but it's important, and it's an important public health thing as well, because open defecation can lead to all kinds of diseases, waterborne diseases. And if you have waterborne diseases, people are too sick to work, and you know, it's not good for a country. And so these sort of very basic things, you know, you don't think about, I'm a development economist, you know, so, you know, you can shout and, you know, say women's rights, but these nitty gritty things like setting up a toilet, which is a boring thing, not as exciting as, you know, some other dramatic things, can have a huge impact on women's lives.
Yeah, I like that. So what you're kind of saying is like, yeah, we can say women's right, but there are little small technicalities that we need to fix within a system.
Yeah, or, you know, the thing is, when we think about rights, right, we think about rights only in terms of what somebody cannot do to me, right? We don't think about in terms of what I have a right to have. I have a right to be free of illness, right? That's a right as well. You know, saying that, okay, you're free to go see a doctor, but if I don't have the means to go get that care, then that right means nothing. But if the country says, I'm going to give you free health care, that's a right. That's a different kind of right? There's a positive versus negative right. Mm-hmm. And it is we have a lot of, often when we think about demanding rights, we think of demanding negative rights. Keep your hands off my body, right? That kind of negative rights. But a positive right is things like being able to live to be 80 years old. Mm-hmm. That's a positive right. And it's in those rights that Bangladeshi leaders have given them those rights, right? Of being able to have access to education, having access to toilets, by, you know, the public health announcements of having contraception, having access to contraception. These are things that actually have given Bangladeshi women a lot of rights. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that is all I need.
Okay.
So I thank you for this interview.
Oh, thank you.
That is recording. Okay, so we just have some pre-written questions about some Muslim women leaders. Mm-hmm. So here they go. Who are some Muslim women leaders that you admire and why?
Oh, okay. I'd say Malala Yousafzai is probably top of that list. I think women's education in Islamic countries, particularly first of all, I should qualify and say that Islam is very different country to country, right? Mm-hmm. To say Islam is one big thing that's a monolithic definition is very problematic. different issues in different countries. Afghanistan being one of the problem countries where women's education is a vital issue for human rights. So the fact that she challenged that with her body at age 16, shot through the head by the Taliban, of course, and then has gone on not only to survive but become a huge advocate for reform in this area, and has won a Nobel Peace Prize, spoken to the United Nations, etc. I think that's very brave of her, and I think she's a really important voice.
Okay.
Also, Shirin Ebadi, who is an Iranian Muslim warrior.
Call me from Cambridge.
Oh, thank you, sir. You're so sweet. Now that's on my interview. That's okay.
Mr. Elliott came in, brought lunch. I'll put that in my PowerPoint. Thank
anyway,
you.
So is this still recording?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So Shirin Ebadi, who is an Iranian activist and lawyer and has worked on women's rights in Iran, and this is becoming particularly important as Iran is undergoing what could potentially be like an Arab Spring, some kind of social revolution for women. And she's got an excellent book called Until We Are Free, which I highly recommend. I know the library has it. And I think she's just also a really important voice. So a lot of this reform has to come from within. And I think having strong women reformers who, especially in countries that are particularly problematic like Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, I think those are going to be really important women to pay attention to.
I heard that in different countries where Islam is very prevalent, like Southeast Asia, it's a little bit more lax on.
Oh yeah, I mean there's 50 some odd Muslim majority countries. There's only 7 that practice what we would call what we don't typically think of when we think of Sharia law. Sharia law just means following proper behavioral path. All Muslims practice Sharia to some extent. When we talk about Sharia law the way we do in the United States, where it's like this draconian, regressive, type of law that's particularly bad to women. There's only a handful of countries that practice that. Jordan, Indonesia, these countries are much more moderate, much more progressive. But Saudi Arabia is a problem, Iran's a problem, Afghanistan's a problem. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, second question. How have Muslim women leaders made an impact in their communities and in the world? That's very general, but...
Yeah, again, reform has to come from within. I think what's happening in Iran is an important moment because we see women who are risking their lives just by taking off their hijab, by being in the streets, in the public, being vocal, speaking up. I can't even begin to name all the journalists, but there's tons of Muslim women journalists who are doing really breathtaking, high-risk work right now, speaking out. There's journalists in India, for example, like Rana Ayub is the one that comes to mind, but there's much more than her. India is having a big problem. India's a democracy, but Muslims are on the brink of genocide right now. The rhetoric that's coming out of India from the right right now is terrifying, and no one's talking about it. Reform, obviously, in places like Afghanistan and Iran, where journalists are speaking out, throwing light on, and often getting punished. I think are important moments where these women leaders could actually effectively shape and change. So I think the journalism and the popular media, social media accounts are where we're seeing some of the bravest women activists right now.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned the hijab, and that's a little bit telling of a similar problem of usually men just telling people what to do with their bodies. So the difference in the United States sometimes is the narrative is you're anti-hijab and that you need to take it off, or in different countries where it's law that you have to keep it on. Is there anything you can say or define in that world of, I don't know how to say problem.
Yeah, I think just to talk about America, America, it's a choice. Muslim women are not being forced to wear hijab in America. Muslims who come here are immigrants, but they want to be here in America, but they also want to be able to practice their religion freely. So, they're straddling two lines. The fact that many Americans see hijab as so I talked about this literally in my class yesterday, so we're talking about American Islamophobia. People who freak out when they see a woman wearing hijab. What is so threatening about that? Why do they get so not only deeply offended, but to the point where they're violent and want to rip that off of a woman or create a hate crime? We talked about yesterday the case in 2015 of the North Carolina students, the 3 young students, 2 girls and a guy, college students, bright, professional, having great lives ahead of them, who were killed by a neighbor who just couldn't stand the fact they were Muslims in his neighborhood. what is it about hijab or these outward sort of markers that so enrage Americans? What is threatening? A lot of it comes from media. There's a demonization of Islam for the media, and this is very deeply entrenched in our policies, like the war on terror, this kind of rhetoric that's been around particularly since 9/11, where we see them as the enemy. They're being cast in that role. So I think the media feeds a lot of this, and of course then we get these negative images of the women who are of course forced, like places in Afghanistan or Iran, who are forced to wear hijab, and we imagine that as symbolic of this kind of global oppression that's really not the case.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What role do Muslim women leaders play in promoting interfaith dialogue and understanding?
Well, there's a good side and bad side to this. You have Muslim women who are, and Muslim men too, but Muslim women who are out there saying, I'm a hijabi. I'll use Ilhan Omar as an example for the positive. So she is, of course, a congresswoman in Minnesota, and she is, she's a beautiful woman. She wears a hijab. Sometimes it's a more conservative one, sometimes it's kind of the fashionable turban, but she doesn't apologize for it. She wears it. She's worn it since her campaign, and she's out there trying to say, I'm normal. I like baseball. I like ice cream. I like rock and roll. I like Prince. I'm doing my job. Everything is fine. I just happen to, this is part of my identity, and that kind of representation is really important. And we're seeing more of that in celebrities and social media and things like that. The negative side is that because women are put in this category where they're considered to be the suppressed category, you have someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a Somali activist. And she wrote, her famous book is Infidel. It's one of her famous books. But she has spoken out against the oppression of her particular experience as a Somali woman. This includes some of the more dark side of some cultural practices in Muslim countries like FGM. And you look at FGM if you don't know what FGM is. I don't know. It's kind of scary.
I will look it up.
But she has also become an atheist now. And the conservative right, uses her as an example because she's like, Islam is problematic, it's oppressive, it doesn't work with the Constitution, it's anti-American. So they prop her up as she's an insider, she's a voice and a woman, and we should be listening to her. So women's voices can have both good and bad effects, and they're kind of using her as the token example of why Islam is bad. So she's an example of a woman using her voice for her own experience, which is a valid experience, but that becomes emblematic of all Muslim women. And then someone like, Ilhan Omar that ends up being not as valid, right?
Yeah, I see. Okay, next question. What lessons can be learned from the leadership styles of Muslim women leaders?
What was it? Repeat it again?
What lessons can be learned from the leadership styles of Muslim women leaders?
Oh, I think same with any outwardly religious leader who wants to show that you can be, modern. You could be, I'll use the case American or representative of your culture, but also devout at the same time and be able to engage in modern issues. So I think Muslim women have a particularly difficult job because the scrutiny is there, right? Because Islam is under so much of a lens globally anyway, and being vilified as this bad thing. So Muslim women have to be able to have the courage to still be Muslim, show that they're still devout, be performatively Muslim, which means oftentimes wearing the hijab, but also be very much representative of their faith. They're stepping up to the microphone. So the pressure on them to talk about their faith, be representative of it, but also try to show it in ways that it could be progressive, it can evolve, that it has potential change, that it's relevant in a modern political landscape. I think this is the responsibility that's incumbent upon Muslim women right now that's particularly difficult.
Thank you. I like that answer. Okay. What are some examples of Muslim women leaders who are working towards promoting human rights and social justice?
The two I mentioned earlier, Abadi and Malala Yousafzai. I'm trying to think of another. Let me think here. I'm so bad with names. But,
Understandable.
I have to look her name up really quickly.
Mhm.
I don't want to get it wrong. I'm not going to find it. Oh, what's her name? I can't. Oh, that's the sound right there. The book. Oh yeah, Zainab and Miriam Al Khawaja, Khawaja. They're from Bahrain. Those are two activists that are worth paying attention to because during Arab Spring, they were the most visible activists for for the resistance in Bahrain. And one sister, Miriam, took kind of the political route. She wrote op-eds. She was doing journalism. She reaching out to political people, politicians, political figures, and ended up getting in so much trouble with the government that she had to flee to Amsterdam. Her sister, Zainab, stayed behind with a daughter and did on the streets activism, right? And got arrested and hauled away and beaten and put in jail. And their father is actually quite famous Bahraini activist, to my knowledge, is still in jail. They're another good example of Muslim activists that are actually trying to make a difference. And because Arab Spring, that's still kind of going on, and it's resolved in some places, but not in places like Bahrain.
Can I ask you to do like a definition of Arab Spring?
So Arab Spring started with a young man in Tunisia who had been harassed by the government, and to the point where he just kind of reached his wit's end, and he did self-immolation. He set himself on fire. Mohammed Bouazizi, I believe his name is, and that, pardon the pun, ignited Arab Spring, and just created a huge revolution. Tunisia managed to successfully transition to a more democratic government, which only recently has started to become problematic. Of course, Egypt had the huge Cairo protests in Tahrir Square, but Syria and Bahrain struggled a little more. Syria, of course, became completely destabilized under Assad's regime, and of course we're still dealing with this. Obama had to deal with a lot of that mess over there, big proxy war. And because of the destabilization of the government, we have groups like ISIS who move in, as well as the freedom fighters who are more Arab Spring-like, and of course Assad's regime. And Bahrain, no one talks about, but Bahrain is a little tiny country that has, I believe it's our 5th naval fleet there, and they're a very important strategic military alliance for us. So we let the King of Bahrain go along with what's going on. But Bahrain has been trying to overthrow a dictatorial government for a long time. And the crackdown on the activists have been ruthless. So Arab Spring has just basically been a movement that started with Tunisia and spread through this part of North Africa in what we call Middle East area. Various countries that had dictators like Gaddafi in Libya, who was toppled, Mubarak in Egypt, of course, who was toppled, Assad, who is challenged but not toppled, trying to get rid of this dictators and replace them with democratic or more modern type of governments. So, still going on. But yeah, 2011 is when that started.
2011,
Yeah.
around 2011. So okay, it's been
A decade.
has it been a whole decade? Like how events were built.
The reason why Arab Spring is particularly important though is because it was an insider movement.
Okay.
It was no pressure from outside. None of us trying to topple the regime and
Yeah.
like what we did in Iran in the 50s and stuff. Because of this insider movement and showing that it's the public that want this change, and that's why Iran is something to watch right now, because you've got a public that is really tired and has the potential to possibly change it from the inside. So.
There was this one quote I found while I was researching for this topic. It was people need to differentiate what they call Islam and what people's thoughts or personal culture on it is. Can you maybe elaborate on that quote?
Yeah, I mean, so Islam is, again, as a category, is not monolithic. Islam in Indonesia is very different than Saudi Arabia, which is very different than Morocco Islam, which is very different from Ghana Islam. So using it as a category that's a stable category is a problem because it's very cultural. And this is the joke I always tell in my classes. I always say Islam is a lot like tofu. It absorbs the flavor of what's around it, right? So when we have issues with Islam, like terrorism exists, of course, a very, very, very small fraction of course, of Muslims who are terrorists, but terrorism exists. Regressive Sharia laws exist in some countries, but these are case by case. You can't judge all of Islam the same. So when people talk about Islam as religion versus culture, I think that's what they're getting into a little bit, or they should be getting into. So when we want to critique something like FGM, which is very specific to certain parts of Africa and Egypt, that is not all of Islam, and it's not even Islamic practice. It just happens to be in those countries. A lot of Muslim women end up falling victim to that particular practice. And same with things like stoning or lashing for adultery, like that kind of harsh corporal punishment for adultery. Pakistan practices this, for example. Not all countries practice that, right? So you have to look at what's going on culturally, which may have more to do with the region than the actual religion, and then the religion itself. This is the danger we run into when we talk about Sharia law in the United States. If there's all kinds, you can look up on YouTube and stuff, there's all kinds of news programs where they walk around Dearborn, Michigan and ask Muslims on the street, hey, do you believe in Sharia law? And they're like, yeah, of course. Because to them, it means being a proper Muslim. They're not talking about stoning women for adultery, they're talking about being a proper Muslim. So we have this idea that Sharia is this dangerous thing, but that's not really what it means. So people confuse what's going on culturally with what is actually properly Islamic practice.
Okay. Next question. How have Muslim women leaders played a role in promoting education and empowerment for girls and women?
Again, Malala Yousafzai probably takes the cake on this. Pakistan is an area to watch right now regarding women's education. They were doing very well for women's literacy, and they're starting to fall behind again. I can't tell you off the top of my head who are the activists doing the work there, but there are scholars and activists throwing light on this particular issue. Someone like Malala, and there will be others beside her, young people, Generation Z and so forth, who will be fighting for this, are really important because they're the ones who are going to challenge the status quo, the patriarchal and religious sort of people who are in power. Taliban, unfortunately, Taliban 2.0 now in Afghanistan is the big issue, and there's all kinds of human rights report coming out right now about Afghanistan and education and women. So I think it's going to be younger generation who are going to have to speak up and fight for these rights, much in the way that Malala did. And Malala's in her late 20s now. She's I guess she's a Gen Z still. She's older Z, young millennial somewhere in there. She's kind of on the borderline. But yeah, it's going to be the younger generation who's going to have to challenge those.
What are some strategies that Muslim women leaders use to amplify their voices and overcome barriers to leadership?
Social media is vital. It really is. Following Muslim women on Twitter, on TikTok. There's been some really amazing TikToks coming out of Iran right now. Facebook less so, but anything that's more immediate type of on-the-ground citizen journalism like Twitter. I know Twitter is not your generation's particular favorite medium, but it is really vital for news right now. And following these voices and these journalists, I think, is where it's happening. We're getting insights, we're getting really good editorials of the experience of Muslim women, we're getting Muslim women lifting up other Muslim women artists, writers, novelists, musicians and stuff who would normally fall by the wayside. So social media, I think, is the most important arena for this sort of activism.
Okay. 2 more questions on this questionnaire. And what can we do to support and uplift Muslim women leaders in their work?
Kind of what I was saying. Be aware of follow these journalists. Check out these novelists and musicians and artists who are doing this. I think there's a lot of difficulty. I think as a professor, we talk about the conversation going on in academia right now is decolonizing our syllabus and making sure all voices are represented. And depending on what you're teaching, it's very easy to go for all the old white guys who've been doing all the scholarship in whatever field, trying to find queer voices, women's voices, people of color's voices, is a big challenge for professors. So I think as far as education goes, making sure that we are using all resources and giving special priority sometimes to Muslim women, if we're looking, especially if we're doing a topic when we're looking at Islam. So it's just a matter of just putting in the effort, I think, more than anything. And then subscribing to these women's feeds and Substacks and journalist type of social media threads.
Thank you. That's a really good answer. What are some of the future opportunities and challenges for Muslim women leaders?
Overcoming the bias, I think. Islamophobia is not an American phenomenon, it is global. It's different in different countries. In India, Islamophobia is a lot to do with the proximity of Pakistan and the way the politics of partition happened. In the United States, it's general xenophobia. It's the fear of the other. If it's not, it's commies and it's Nazis and it's well, Nazis we should fear, of course, obviously. But I mean, there's always a bad guy. We have to have a bad guy historically, right?
Yeah.
And it's Muslims right now. It has been since the 90s. So I think for American Islamophobia is the biggest challenge of having more awareness. And the other thing is the way our laws are working in the United States is we're trying to decrease the visibility of Muslims, right? People are trying to pass laws that ban hijab. They're trying to say we don't want more Muslims to migrate in here. We need absolutely more Muslims to migrate here. America is 1% Muslim. Most people are shocked by that. 1% of Americans are Muslim. That's a tiny percent. People think it's like 40%. It would be great if it's 40% because it would be normalized, right?
There would be a mosque on basically in every city.
Yeah, and seeing young women wearing hijab on campus would be normal, right? It needs to be normalized. So this Islamophobia in America is probably the biggest hurdle we have to and especially regarding women, because again they are very visibly Muslim if they're observant, if they're wearing the hijab. I think is the biggest hurdle we have.
Is there any mosque close to Milledgeville or?
No, and I don't know of any hijabis on campus right now. When I've various years, there's been 1, 2, I think 3 or 4, maybe a couple years ago at the most. Now there may be Muslim women on campus who are not observant or wearing hijab, and I'm sure there are some Muslim men, but it's definitely a minority. We're not the most diverse campus, obviously.
Yeah.
There was a Muslim students group for a long time. I don't know if they're even still a group anymore. I know about 3 years ago they were still around. So definitely a lack of presence here. Milledgeville doesn't have anything. I think Athens might be the closest Muslim center. Yeah.
Not even Macon? Or?
I don't. They may have a center. They don't have a mosque. I don't think. The mosques. There are 14 mosques up in Atlanta. Okay. And usually this time of year, if you follow some of the mosques on Facebook, they have like visit a mosque day, and I've gone to those. I would love to take students there. Where you go and it's just a bunch of people, a lot of white people who sit there and want to learn more about Islam, and they sit there and they get a little food, and then mom comes out and talks to them. And there's question and answer, and it's very, very positive. So yeah, if you have the opportunity to visit a mosque in Macon, or in Atlanta, they're very, very friendly and welcoming places.
Okay. Here's another question. For the question, if I were to ask a modern Muslim woman, if there's anything you would like to be asked, what is the biggest question, probably?
Oh gosh, I can't even begin to speculate on that. Yeah, I don't know. I can't even begin to speculate on that.
Okay.
Yeah, since I'm not Muslim myself. But,
that is okay.
Yeah.
That is okay.
Yeah, and I would imagine that every woman's experiences, things they want to talk about are different. So
yeah. Okay, that is the end of our interview. Is there any final thoughts or words you would like to say?
Nope, I can't think of any.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm